Welcome to the Hockey Writers Fantasy Forecheck. I'm your host, Caleb Kerney,
And I am Jacob Strozyk.
the co-host. We're going to be talking to you about all things fantasy, Keeper League, Redraft, and Dynasty. Thanks for tuning in with us. We're going to give you hot players to pick up, prospects on the rise, sleepers you should or shouldn't think of acquiring, and prospects who are looking to break out at the NHL level. This week's topic is going to be going through the pros and cons of redraft leagues. Jacob, why don't you kick us off and tell us about some hot players?
Yeah, so when it comes to the hot players, these are the ones that maybe you were sitting them, and at this point in the year, you should probably be starting them, or players that could be sitting on the wire for wire because they were fringe and you might want to pick them up for cheap, or you might be able to use them as a trading chip to pick up some pieces down the road. First one I want to talk about is Tyler Seguin, Dallas Stars center. In the last 6 games, he has 7 points. He has 2 multi-point games, and he is getting more ice time than he was. Since the Stars have their top unit in Pavelski, Hintz, Robertson, Seguin has been able to step back and kind of be the second line role. He doesn't need to be the top guy with Jamie Benn anymore. And he's not the top guy with Jamie Benn anymore. They've transitioned to their younger players now. So Seguin getting more ice time, but at the same time still being able to play in a slightly lesser role, slightly less pressure role, is really benefiting him as of late. He had a really slow start to the year, but as of right now, he's picking it up. His scoring is coming back a little bit more. He's shooting a little bit more. So I think he's one of the better players to pick up if he's sitting on a waiver wire, or someone that you could make a simple move for.
Yeah, definitely. If there's a team in your league that has them and they're not doing well, and cost of acquisition is fairly low, he's definitely a good guy to bet on. In his last 5 games, pardon me, he's got 18 shots, which is ridiculous, and 9 hits. So you're also getting, category coverage in your category leagues. 18 shots in 5 games. That's over 5 shots a game. So he's really turning it up. And I think Jacob kind of hit it on the head there, where, he said he's not the top guy in Dallas anymore. And that might have been something that was kind of messing with his confidence or his head a little bit, his mental game. So he was just kind of off, and then he had those injuries. But now he can just focus on playing his game. Just like Jacob said, he doesn't carry the offensive burden for this team anymore. So I think that's a really great pickup. And yeah, but in the last 5 games that he's played, his ice time has been between 17 and 20 minutes a night. Like, he is playing a lot, so he's getting the opportunity. And his shooting percentage this year is only 11.9%, which is a touch higher than his career average. So there is some sustainability to this if the pucks keep going in. But Jacob, you got another player for us. Who is it?
Yeah, so the other one we're going to talk about is Chicago Blackhawks defenseman Seth Jones. He is on a nice short game kind of heater here. He has 8 points in his last 4 games. And he also has 2 multi-point games in that time span. He has really transitioned from just being a one-dimensional type of defender, and he's learning to play defense even more since he started being paired up with Jake McCabe. So look to see him also get some more blocks. He might step up and make a couple more hits. He's not usually a huge hitter, but he still will start playing a little bit more physical, having someone like McCabe as his D partner. So he's going to start spreading out his points fantasy-wise into a couple more categories, but where his primary value lies is in his offensive ability and his offensive instincts. He's great at getting assists. He scores goals here and there, and he eats up a lot of ice time, and he plays on the power play. So he is good for power play points too. So he's someone that you can warily pick up, not someone that you're going to want to make a big trade for or anything, but he's someone that is a little bit more on the fringe that you could make a simple move for, or otherwise, I would say if you're looking to offload someone who's hot, this would be the time to do it, and he's the player that you would want to do it with.
100%. This guy is on fire right now. You know, in his last 5 games, he's got 13 shots and 16 hits. That's incredible coverage across the board. You know, his career shooting percentage is 4.9%, and so far this year he's shooting 4.5. So he's actually shooting a little lower than his career shooting percentage, which is kind of nice to see. That shows you that there is potential for even more points. He's getting the ice time, 3.5 minutes on the power play, almost 25 minutes on average over the entire year in all situations. Definitely a solid pickup. And speaking of pickups, some prospects that are on the rise that you should be interested in that aren't NHL regulars yet, but are definitely trending to be great and even elite players. I've got 2 for you today. One of them is a Detroit Red Wings prospect, probably my favorite prospect that the Red Wings have. Anybody who knows me is not going to be surprised about Marco Kasper. Kasper, he's playing in the SHL right now for Rogla BK. He's played 36 games so far this year, 7 goals, 12 assists for 19 points. Across the whole season, he's averaging about 16 minutes and 18 seconds time on ice. He's already surpassed his point totals from last year by 8 points, which he played 10 more games last year than he has this year so far. His time on ice the past 5 games has just been skyrocketing. 17 minutes, 11 seconds, 17 minutes, 31 seconds, 18 minutes, 52 seconds, 22 minutes and 2 seconds, and 19 minutes and 30 seconds. He's definitely in the top 6 there for Rogla. And, you know, these past 5 games, his ice time reflects like a number 1 center there, which for a guy in his D+1, you love to see it. And the biggest thing about Kasper, he has more skill than people give him credit for, and his work ethic and motor, you cannot stop this kid with a freight train. So coaches are going to love him. Fans are going to love him when they see him playing every night, you know, when he inevitably earns a roster spot on the Red Wings next year, which I believe he will. Jacob, do you have any thoughts?
Kasper is, I was super excited about Kasper as a player. And seeing him go to the Red Wings, as soon as it happened, I thought to myself, that's a perfect fit for what they're trying to do over there. And Kasper has all of the right makings of being an eventual number 1 center. He does everything. He can win draws, he can score, he's a playmaker, and he's just a great all-around player. He kind of reminds me of one of the Sabres players that's kind of breaking out this year, Dylan Cousins. It's a similar motor that they kind of run on. Everything just kind of goes and goes and goes, and you can't really stop them. Even if his production isn't fantastic right away, give him 1 or 2 years. He's the kind of player that'll figure it out and be able to give you points coverage for goals, assists, face-offs, shots, and don't be surprised if he has a decent number of block shots in there as well. He's a great 2-way forward. So I think he has one of the greatest potentials for any recently drafted player in any team system, honestly.
Yeah, his skill is really underrated. He's tried in Michigan so far this year, which didn't end up going in, but on the same play was able to maintain possession in the zone, and his team did score. So he might not have scored on that play, but he initiates a lot. He's aggressive. He drives to the net. He's constantly in the goalie's kitchen, just messing with the goalie, just getting under their skin. And he's really scrappy player, really competitive. And yeah, he's definitely going to be a guy to look out for, definitely next year. And speaking of next year, a 2023 draft eligible is the next guy I'm going to talk about, and that's Zack Benson. This guy is on fire right now. He's playing for the Winnipeg Ice. In the WHL, that should be familiar to some people. There was a couple draft eligibles that came from that team last year. Matt Savoy, Connor Geekie. He's outperforming both of those players this year. In 37 games played in the WHL, he's got 25 goals, 38 assists for 63 points, which leaves him second in the WHL for scoring behind some guy named Bedard.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. The next two guys that are in line in the scoring race are two other draft eligibles, which is also another unusual thing to see. So many draft eligibles at the top of the score sheet for points for WHL. But Andrew Crystal and Cohen Zeimer, they're both at 62 points. The general scouting report is Benson is kind of a better overall player. As I was scouting some guys last year and listening to podcasts, every time somebody talked about Savoy and Geekie, they also brought up Benson. And so he's been on the map for a while because of the talent that's in this draft. He's probably going to go later than he should. Most rankings have him as high as 4th and as low as 10th. I think if you draft him in your dynasty league at 10th, that's an absolute steal. This guy's going to be an all-around great player. He's already fantastic right now. But some players who maybe aren't doing fantastic are the sleepers that you should think of acquiring or not think of acquiring. And Jacob, who do we got this week?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with Evander Kane because he came back from his really, really rough injury that he had earlier this season, and he hasn't quite gotten himself back up to speed. He came back much earlier than they were expecting him to. Most people were thinking he's going to be out for the rest of the season, but here he is, ready to go in late January. So, I mean, that's great for him. It's definitely great for the Oilers overall because he is great for scoring, but as far as fantasy goes, he's really one of the best fantasy players you can generally have. He gets a lot of hits. He's good for getting penalty minutes because he's Evander Kane and he does dumb things, but he's also a pest. So he's going to be irritating people. He might have a couple of fights here and there. He scores a lot of goals, especially when he plays with high-end players like McDavid or Draisaitl. He played a lot with McDavid earlier in the year, and he played a lot with him last year. So I don't see that. I don't see any reason why he would be out of that equation for too long. But right now he's sitting with 0 points since he's come back, and he's getting less ice time than he typically would. So right now he's just one of the colder players. If you can find somebody to maybe give him to you or trade him to you for maybe a lower end trade, I think you get an absolute steal for somebody like Kane. He might be cold, but he's not going to stay cold. He's the kind of guy that just goes, and he gets all the types of points that you need for categories or points leagues. He covers everything across the board.
100%. He's definitely a buy now. If the cost is right, buy him, no matter what league you're in. Maybe not in dynasty leagues if you have to hold on to players, and like the way he's kind of exited some of his previous teams brings some kind of risk attached to him as far as dynasty goes, because you never know when he could do something and just his relationship with the team or with the management is just fractured and then he just needs to get shipped out. So there is that sort of risk. It's kind of a lesser risk, but he's he's played 3 games since returning. He's got 13 shots, 10 hits. There's your category coverage, right? Over 4 shots a game, over 3 hits a game. That's beautiful. His ice time is down. Like Jacob said, it's about 17 minutes a night since coming back from injury. Just before he was injured, he was playing 20 minutes a night. So a little bit less to kind of ease him in. And his career shooting percentage is 9.9%. This year so far is 7.9%. So there is definitely some puck luck that should be coming his way, some positive regression. He's playing with elite players, and you always want those guys. Even Raty, when he played with McDavid, several years ago, he had some value, at least as a streamer, whenever he was playing with McDavid. So definitely a fantastic option to pick up. And now, Jacob, what about your next player? Is he a fantastic guy to pick up? Why don't you tell us about him?
Next we have Islanders forward Anders Lee. He's not one I would say to pick up. He's more of a sit rather than start type of player. Lee, right now, he has 1 point in his last 6 games. He's averaging less than 2 shots per game, so he's not getting any coverage there. He's not really playing super physical either, and his ice time is still regulated to that kind of second line role, despite being a player that has the capacity for 30, maybe 40 goals in him. So right now he's just ice cold. He hasn't got any, he doesn't really have anything going for him. So I'm not saying he's a player you'd want to drop for somebody else that's hot, because he is someone that typically is fairly consistent. He's just on a bit of a cold stretch right now with the Islanders. So if he's more of a player, if you have him, sit him over somebody who's playing a little bit better than him right now, or someone that might be a little hotter than him until he starts heating up again. But he's definitely a player that should be rotated out of your lineup as opposed to rotated in right now.
Absolutely. 100%. But some guys that you could potentially think about rotating in are some of my prospect breakout candidates. And these are prospects that have some NHL experience, that are poised to solidify their place with their respective teams and really increase their value over the coming year to become legitimate fantasy assets. And I'm going to stick with the Islanders for a brief moment and just talk about Aatu Raty. And Raty is a fantastic player in his own right. He hasn't quite shown it at the NHL level, but the opportunity hasn't quite been there yet. And he's played 8 games at the NHL level right now, 8 minutes and 28 seconds of time on ice a night, and about 51 seconds of power play time on ice. In those 8 games, he's got 2 goals, 10 shots, 7 hits. The hits are okay. The shots are kind of whatever. And definitely the points, aren't there right now. But just yesterday, Clutterbuck was announced as being injured indefinitely, whatever that means. The rumblings that I've heard is potentially the rest of the season. And if that's the case, Raty has a real big opportunity here to solidify himself with the team. In the very least, he can play bottom 6, which is kind of what's happened so far, because he's really good on the forecheck. He isn't afraid to be physical and aggressive, and coaches just love that, especially the Islanders. With Barry Trotz, he loves those, grit and sandpaper kind of players, and he can play that game. But he also has a lot of skill, and he can really find the back of the net. He really dropped in his draft year for a lot of different reasons that we don't really need to get into. But I think, come next year, he's a guy who's really going to be fantasy relevant, especially if he can see an uptick for the rest of the season. If he can get to even just like 12 minutes a night, that would be fantastic. One opening that I potentially see is playing with, if he can play with Barzal, that would be ideal. This last game, it was Lee, Barzal, and Cizikas, and Raty is better than Cizikas. He might not be a better pro right now, so in the coach's eyes, he doesn't seem better, but he's definitely better. He's definitely more offensive. So I think if they can inject Raty, even though he's a natural center, if they can inject him on the wing in the top 6 somewhere, whether it's with Nelson or Barzal, that can really help get everybody going, especially with this sort of this slump that the Islanders are going through. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on Raty?
Yeah, Raty is a really interesting player. He did have that massive drop-off in his draft year that kind of made him slide from the first round all the way down towards the lower end of the second round where he ultimately got picked, but he still has all the right tools to be a top 6 NHL forward. He might not be there right now, but for the type of player that he is, he's going to offer a lot of value within, I would say, 3 to 4 years. He's going to take some time to adjust to how everything is played here, and everything will just kind of line up very slowly for him just because of how his development has gone this year and because of how good the forward group in New York is. It's not out of this world good, but they're good enough that it's going to be tough to crack that top 6 and stay there as a young forward. I think he would be best suited in that role within, I would say, a year or two, but I don't think he's going to get the results that are expected for another maybe 3 to 4 years. But he's a fantastic all-around player, like you mentioned. He does get shots. He can score goals. He does get hits. He can play both center and wing. You're right, he is a natural center. So it might be tough to fit him in on that top unit with Barzal, but it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to have him adjust to playing wing as opposed to center, especially since it's always nice to have a forward on the wing that can play a more defensive or physical style to open up room for his teammates. And that's just going to give you more benefits if you have a deeper league. So if you have room to take up more players from the same team, so if you can pick up Barzal, if you could pick up Nelson, if you can grab any of the higher end Islanders forwards, I think he would just complement them well if you're able to get 2 or 3 of them on your roster.
100%. And somebody who you should also consider putting on your roster, my other breakout prospect, Mason McTavish. He's not completely lighting it up, but he's heating up. In 46 games played this season, he's got 9 goals, 18 assists, 100 shots, 40 hits. That's some nice coverage across the board. 2.5 minutes on power play time on ice, getting about 15 minutes overall. Right now, he's playing the top line with Henrique and Terry. He plays with that jam and that grit, and that's kind of opening up space for Henrique and Terry. Terry's more of just like an all-skill kind of guy. Henrique's kind of an all-around two-way guy. And obviously, it's going to take him some time to get used to the NHL, but he is definitely somebody to consider drafting in the later rounds of a redraft next year. If you're in a keeper league or a dynasty league, definitely pick him up, as Anaheim is kind of on the upswing. He's going to be a guy to definitely own. And, he's too good to play OHL, and he could play in the AHL, but it doesn't seem like Anaheim wants to do that this year. So that's going to wrap up that section of the podcast. And we're going to hop into our topic of the week, which this week is going to be the pros and cons of redraft leagues. Jacob, do you have a couple pros for us for redrafts?
Yeah, so if you're in your redraft leagues, everything kind of boils down to how am I going to finish this year over next year. You're not really able to roll over too many high-end players, if at all, to the next season. So now is the time to start planning and getting your strategy in order. As far as a pro for your redraft league, it's really great if you don't have the how do I put this? If you don't have the overall experience of keeping players or being a part of a deeper league, redraft leagues typically have lower roster numbers, or they have just fewer players in them, and it's a lot more forgiving in that sense. So being in a redraft league gives you a lot more flexibility as opposed to your keeper or dynasty leagues, where everything is a lot more set in stone. There's a lot of carryover to the next year. There's a lot of consistency, and there's a lot more need to kind of predict, well, this player might not have been good this year, but they're going to be good next year. I'm going to hold on to them. You don't really need to do that as much in a redraft league. You can focus a lot more on how do I win now? And you don't need to be afraid to say, I'm going to trade these two really good players for one great player. And you might be able to get that deal done if you're a higher end team trading two good players to a lower end team trading one really great player. So it has a lot more movement in star players, which makes it, in my opinion, a little bit more fun sometimes, because you're able to make those big moves and you're able to somehow trade, maybe let's use the players that we talked about today. You're maybe able to trade a Seth Jones and a Tyler Seguin and pick up somebody like Sidney Crosby, or you could pick up somebody like Sebastian Aho, who just had a hat trick. So you can trade those kind of mid-tier or good players for the stars, and I just think it makes it more fun.
Yeah, there is a sort of carefree nature to it that is really great for casual fans, or for people who are just entering the world of fantasy hockey. And depending on how savvy and how casual or not casual these other fans are, some people might not even be aware of hot streaks and cold streaks and all that sort of thing. So you can definitely, if you read up on those things and listen to those podcasts like this one, shameless plug, that can really put you ahead in those leagues. And the lack of carryover from year to year is also refreshing, and just getting a clean start for the next year. And you'd be like, okay, those players didn't do well, or those players were cold at the beginning of the year. So maybe I still get those players, but just reevaluate my expectations once you sort of see some tendencies for some players. And there can definitely be those exciting trades. In the redraft league that I was in, there was less of those trades. I also think some of the people that I was in the league with weren't super active. So it was more minor trades, just trying to trade people that I had who were on hot streaks for people who are looking to get on hot streaks, or potentially breaking out, that kind of a thing. So there is some great aspects to it. And probably the biggest thing that I think for people just starting out is the time commitment isn't enormous. You can set your lineups up daily. You can also in Yahoo, there is a button where it's like auto pick or something for the whole week, or play starting players. So Yahoo will recognize who has games on what days. And if that's all you want to do and you want to just trust the players you have, you can do that. But then if you also, every morning and every night, looking at the waiver wire, looking at the guys who you're starting, if there's somebody on the wire who's better than somebody you have, and putting in claims to pick up those players, that's definitely, you can definitely be a bit more engaged with it. So I would say that those are a pretty decent summary of sort of the pros of redraft leagues. Jacob, is there anything else you could think of?
So you kind of touched on one thing that I noticed from the Yahoo leagues. The Yahoo leagues have a lot of analytics that you can look at for individual players. You can see a lot of different metrics, and they even have suggestions. They'll say sit this player over start this player, or pick up this player and drop this other player. You can use those sometimes to your advantage. Maybe if you aren't as involved as some other fantasy owners are. And they do have some merit to them. But ultimately, nothing beats actually watching games and noticing players, who's hot, who's cold, who's doing well, and being able to try and determine trends yourself. Being in a redraft league gives you the forgiveness of being able to be wrong about those picks. You don't have to worry about the fact that maybe you dropped Evander Kane when you should have held on to him, and you picked up maybe somebody like Brock Besser or somebody kind of on that lower end just because they were ranked higher in Yahoo's numbers system. And it might have told you should pick up this player and drop this player because they're not ranked the same way. So I notice that a lot when I go through my own Yahoo app. It'll tell me to sit one of my players that's currently streaking for a player that hasn't scored a point in the past like 2 or 3 games. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. So you can be wary with it, but don't be afraid if you're in a redraft league to take that chance yourself. You don't have to pay attention to all of the numbers and analytics. You're welcome to use them. They're a great tool to have, but don't rely solely on them for the sake of making your team good this year. Be willing to take that risk. Take the chance that maybe you can try and figure it out yourself and make a prediction. And then when you do pick up that player that everybody else thought, no, there's no way, and then they end up putting up a bunch of different points for you, whether it be in a points league or a categories league, it doesn't matter. But if they're the reason that you made a great surge during this week or during this month, you can feel really great about the fact that you took that chance on your own whim and picked that player up. So that's one of the best parts about the redraft leagues is you can make the mistake and not feel too bad about it because next year you can just try again.
100%. And that's a really great point about the analytics there. You know, just touching on that very briefly with fan tracks, which is more common to use for keeper and dynasty leagues, especially dynasty leagues, is there's some, they have some metrics there and some projections. And I think Yahoo has projections as well, based on points generated per game on average for all the players. In my category league, Fantrax does a similar thing where it figures out the average of all the hits and the points and the shots for all of your skaters and comes up with what their average is. And then when you're going into a matchup, it'll project what your potential category numbers might be. And that can be, that sort of thing is a great tool for me sometimes to figure out, okay, this guy is playing less games than this other player, but they're averaging more hits, they're averaging more shots. So I'm actually going to get more hot shots and hits if I start this other player who's playing a game or two less, but the potential there for more is also there. So that's a really, really great point about the analytics side of things. As far as cons go with redraft leagues, my biggest beef, and this might be the only con, because redraft leagues are really nice to play in, really fun, but they can only get so intense. There is a limit to the intensity and to the engagement. You can increase the intensity and engagement. I think you can set up some salary caps in some situations, depending on if it's a Yahoo thing or if it's like through your work, through, I can't remember what the site is right now, where you have like a salary cap. Each player has a salary. And so you have to also factor that into the players that you pick up. I think that's more common in maybe roto leagues and less head-to-head. But there is that limit to intensity, which I got to a point where that just wasn't enough for me. I needed something more intense. I needed something where I felt like a general manager. Jacob, what do you think?
Yeah, so honestly, for me, the best part about redraft leagues can also be the worst part about the redraft leagues because, like I said, you have that big turnover every year, so you don't really get to hold on to those players that maybe you formed an attachment to, or maybe that you feel have consistency and perform well when they're on your team. I don't know about anybody else, but for me, there always seems to be players when I pick them up, they do nothing. But then when I give them to somebody else, it's like, wow, they're a superstar. So, you have those other players on the opposite end of the spectrum where maybe they perform only for you and they don't perform for everybody else. So maybe those are the players that you would keep kind of in a keeper or a dynasty style league, but you're not able to do that when everything's getting shuffled around and redrafted. And on top of that, if you keep redrafting the entire league every single year, while it's nice to kind of rearrange the players and how the power is distributed throughout the year, it's still random. So maybe this year you got that first overall pick and you were able to get McDavid. And then next year you end up picking maybe sixth overall. And the best player you're going to end up getting is Kucherov. Not a terrible choice, but still not the same as if you were picking first. And then as the years continue down the line, maybe you never get that first overall pick again and your team just is harder and harder to make compete because you can't get those high-end players that you want or the players that you maybe trust because everybody else goes, yeah, I need that, or yeah, I want that, and they pick them before you. So it's a little bit random and it's kind of based off luck. So I think that's kind of one of the few cons that do exist for redraft is the fact that you can't have consistency across years unless you keep picking up the same players by chance.
That's a great point, Jacob, and that's a great place to stop our discussion about this. Thanks for tuning in this week. Next week, we're going to be talking about tips for drafting prospects in redraft leagues. Should you do it? Should you not do it? What kind of prospects should you target? We're going to talk about all that next week. So make sure you tune in for our discussion about that. You can follow us on social media. You can follow the podcast on Twitter now at THWFANTASY. That's THW Fantasy. I'm on Twitter at Caleb Scouting.
And I'm also on Twitter at Stroz67. You can see it as Dr. Ice Tilt.
Dr. Ice Tilt. If you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the Hockey Writers YouTube channel. If you're listening in podcast format, subscribe to the Hockey Writers Podcast Network, and please leave a review on whatever platform you listen to. You've been listening to the Hockey Writers Fantasy Forecheck. Keep your stick on the ice, get pucks in deep, and give it 110%. See you next week.